everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, May 20th, 2019, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Actually, you know what? At the top of the show, I always say the date that the episode is going to drop, but I'm usually recording that earlier because it goes through the edit process. Right now, it's 5 days before, I'm time traveling a bit. It's 5 days before the episode drops, and I am recording in a hotel room in Tampa, Florida, where I'm filming for my new show, which I can actually finally talk about because it's been announced. I'm involved in the reboot of Brain Games on National Geographic. The host is Keegan Michael Key. I am the field host. It's been so much fun filming it. It's been a whirlwind. It's been exhausting. I'm really excited to announce that it will be airing on National Geographic Channel in a ton of countries and a ton of languages on December 1st, 2019. Also, as you could tell from my episode last week, I've been traveling quite a bit. I've been filming all over the U.S. I've been doing some work on the East Coast with The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and then I went to Namibia in Africa and then came back to continue filming and to do some promotion around the show. So I've been living out of a suitcase for quite some time, definitely ready to get back home. I am very excited, though, about an episode that I have filmed while I was here on the road, and we're going to dive into that in a second. But first, I want to thank those of you who have made Talk Nerdy possible this week and every week. I say it all the time. That is because it continues to be true. Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support from listeners just like yourselves. And if you want to pledge your support, you can visit patreon.com/talknerdy and read all about how to sign up. Those of you who supported this week include Phil T-Bear, the Zombie Drummer, David J.E. Smith, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. Thank you so very much from the bottom of my heart. There's other ways to support the show. You can rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, any other podcatcher, place where you get your show. You can also visit talknerdymerch.com and shop for some cool swag. There's even some with Killer's face on it. Science dog. You know you love it. All right, that's enough of that. Let's dive into the show. This week, I had the privilege to have a conversation with Byron Pace. He is actually a filmmaker, a conservationist, the director of photography and camera operator and editor for Pace Productions. Yes, that's what I mean when I say he's a filmmaker. He's also a hunter, and he's the co-host of the Into the Wilderness podcast with his brother Daryl, which is all about the hunting and conservation scene, not just in the UK where he lives in Scotland, but I think across the globe. And he was at the conference that I was at in Namibia, and he taught me an awful lot about conservation hunting. I think he's going to open your eyes as well. So without any further ado, everybody, here he is, Byron Pace. Well, Byron, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on.
Sorry, that's how I start all my episodes. A little awkward because we've been hanging out all day. So early on, I introduced where I am and why we're having this conversation, which is a little bit out of the norm because usually when I'm recording, I'm sitting in my very comfortable, very air-conditioned studio. Instead
of a hot, sweaty hotel room in Namibia.
In Namibia, yeah. Usually I'm in Los Angeles, which is a little bit different. So I've met you now, how many days ago?
My brain is like totally frazzled from all the information we've taken on the last couple of days, but I think it was 3 days, isn't it?
3 days,
day
yeah.
Number 3, I think.
It's Friday, so maybe on Wednesday. And you had been here in Africa for a while. You hadn't come straight from Scotland, had you?
No, I came from Scotland, flew into Joburg where my grandparents live. I actually had some clients hunting down in the Eastern Cape who I was just there kind of looking after, just making sure they were happy. And then I went on to spend some time with the African Pangolin Working Group and some of the research that they're doing. We raised a bunch of money to provide some equipment on the ground for them, but I'd never seen a pangolin before, and actually I'd never met the team. We just got to know them. It was a great cause, and every year through our company we try and raise money for something related inside conservation. And
And to be clear, for the American ears on the podcast, you are saying pangolin, not penguin.
No, definitely not a penguin.
Okay.
I've actually never seen a penguin in flesh other than in the zoo.
Really? You've never seen a penguin?
Well, not in the wild.
Really?
No.
Oh, interesting.
I would love to. But no.
You've seen so many wild animals, and I'm like, oh, I've seen penguins.
Yeah,
I saw penguins in the Galapagos and in
now you're just showing off.
New Zealand? Australia. Phillips Island, I think. They have like these funny little blue penguins.
I saw quokkas in Australia, but I didn't see any penguins.
Quokkas are the best. But I have never seen a pangolin in the wild.
So few people have.
Yeah.
And this is the crazy thing. It is the most trafficked mammal in the world. And yet, even people who live here, so there's 4 species in Asia and there's 4 species in the continent of Africa. And even people who live here have barely seen them. I was speaking to my grandparents who have lived here basically their entire life. And I stayed with them just the night before I went to go on the sort of 5 days with the guys from the Pangolin Working Group and telling them about it, showing them the pictures, and they'd never even seen one.
And is that because they are so critically endangered, or is it because they're also, stay hidden away from view, or is it a combination of the two?
I think it's mainly because they're elusive. Because
that
even
would be the word I was looking for.
Even 50 years ago, people were not seeing them. So they're mainly nocturnal, and they're just pretty secretive animals. And during the day, they'll find a burrow or a cave or somewhere to hide around in. And they don't really make their presence known. It's not like they really make much noise, although they are, when they're walking through like bushes and stuff, they're pretty clumsy and they just kind of plow through things. So yeah, I was doing that before I came here, and then prior to this event in Namibia, I came out maybe a week before to spend some time with a contact of mine just about 3 hours north of Windhoek, where he has a hunting, not a concession, it's a farm, it's 30,000+ acres, it's privately owned, and they have hunting on one side of it and they also have tourism on the other. So he's involved in sort of both sides of the tourism industry in Namibia. So I wanted to understand how he operated, what the comparison was between these two forms, and also he's involved in some really interesting projects to do with repopulating certain species back into a new national park in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. So I was intrigued to find out more about that. All I knew at the point before meeting him was that this was happening. And now I have a much better understanding of it, and it was fascinating to meet him and the team and what they're doing there.
So to unpack a little bit of what you said, even just here in this intro, you mentioned, I want to talk about pangolins actually for a minute before we get into the
problem,
meat.
they're so cool.
Yeah, seriously. And I mean, at this point, I think people who have never heard the word pangolin have probably started to Google it. Unless you're in your car, don't do that. That's illegal. And are learning more about what pangolins look like and maybe a little bit about their plight. But before we talk about that, you mentioned that you had clients in South Africa, hunting clients.
Yeah, they were, yeah.
So, I introduced you as a filmmaker. What is a hunting
Filmmaking
client?
to hunting. So,
yeah.
I mean, I have always hunted in some form ever since being a little kid. I suppose actually the first form of people who fish don't like me to say this, but the first form of hunting I did was actually fishing.
Okay.
I kind of see it as the same thing. You're hunting with a rod. You're still pitting your wit against a wild animal. So
some people spearfish.
They spearfish, yeah.
Yes,
okay, so
that's very hunty.
That's very more hunty,
yeah.
Right? But I have spearfished, but only a little bit, and much later in life. So my early experiences were fishing for pike in the Highlands of Scotland, and then hunting for rabbits with my dad. So I've grown up within sort of hunting circles. To give you an idea of my sort of position in hunting now and how I use it at home, about 80 to 90% of all the meat that's in my freezer, I've killed myself, or has been given to me by other friends who hunt, or sometimes a local estates, which I don't know if estate really translates in the States.
Like a homestead, like something
yeah,
owns?
It's more like a ranch.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so we're talking the one that I have in my mind, where I buy carcasses from, like deer carcasses. It's 50,000+ acres, so it's fairly big. And through their management system of deer, they put a lot of game meat into the food chain through game dealers, and I go and buy carcasses from them. So it's wild game that I eat, and that's what I use most of my sort of hunting knowledge and ability for.
So when you say 80 to 90% of what's in your freezer is hunted, is 80 to 90% of your diet game, or do you still eat, pork and chicken?
I do.
And beef?
I eat a bit of lamb, a bit of beef.
Oh, lamb. Yeah, that's a thing, right? Yeah. People don't eat much lamb in the U.S., I don't think.
No, it's not really a thing.
No. Mm-mm.
Interestingly, I don't know whether it's just because of my background in understanding the full connection with food and being 100% responsible for so much of my food. But even when it comes to livestock, I actually end up sourcing quite a lot of that myself as well. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of farmer friends, some of whose farms I also hunt on. And, very often I'll buy a sheep off them. Yeah. So I buy a sheep off and then do all the butchering myself and then put it in the freezer. So
it's quite funny.
But I do use the shops. Yeah. I'm not a total hillbilly.
There's this kind of stereotype, I think, of hunters, and of course we'll be diving into this much more as well. But I think there's this kind of stereotype of hunters as these very rugged, manly men who are.
I like to think of myself as a rugged manly man,
and who are also maybe a bit, I don't know, not terribly progressive politically. And I think when you look at there's a show that used to be on the air in the United States, and I'm fucking blanking on the
Alaska
name.
People? Or...
No. I'm actually thinking of something that's quite the opposite. It's the Put a Bird on It show, Portlandia, which is the show about total hipster Portland hipsters, very progressive liberal hipsters. Yeah. But there's a very famous episode where they go to sit down at a restaurant and they want to order this free range chicken, and they're asking so many questions about the chicken that finally they're I need to meet where this chicken came from myself.
In fact, I need to meet the chicken.
Yeah, and so they get up from the table and they take a drive to this local farm, and they start meeting the chicken, because of course it's so important to them that they are really, I think, intimately familiar with where their food came from. And it's so funny that in some ways that kind of comes full circle, that there's, I think, much more connection between this, what we think of in the U.S. as this sort of lefty, liberal view about food, and what we think of as often a very conservative and kind of aggressive, maybe testosterone-laden view of food. They're not so far apart.
There's so much common ground there. Yeah. And to me, one of the most interesting changes in the hunting world has come from that sort of hipster side of it. Yeah. Where there's this intrigue in food and a real will to understand where it comes from. And that is... we can talk about the trophy hunting aspect. I'm sure we'll probably get onto that. But if you're just looking at it from a food point of view, which is a lot of the reason that a lot of people hunt, especially in North America, it is for food, or it certainly is a byproduct of it. And it's hard to get a better appreciation of your interaction with the animals that you consume than by hunting it. Oh, absolutely. I think the vast majority of us in the United States are incredibly removed from our food. We're not just the States. I think the world over is especially the Western world. Because it's so urbanized.
Sure. We're eating, highly processed food. We're eating food that no longer even, I think, visually represents the animal that it came from.
Importantly, doesn't visualize it, because I think if you visualized it more in terms of packaging, I think it put a lot of people off now.
Oh, absolutely. And even not just the packaging, but the way that we eat, chicken, we eat it in breast form, or it's chopped and processed and made into nuggets. It's no longer on the bone. It no longer looks like the anatomy of the animal. And in some ways, I think that's what makes it more appealing to many people. But it does make us very far away from our food. So when we try to think about ethical issues, especially with regards to things like factory farming and treatment of animals, we'd just rather not think about it.
It's the easy option,
of course,
not to think about, because to really tackle those problems, you have to think about it in every aspect of your life. So it means that if you're eating out, like the example that you just gave, really, if you're trying to be environmentally responsible and you care about all animal welfare, whether that be livestock or wildlife, you should always be asking the questions. So for me, one of the questions that I always ask at home in Scotland, if I'm eating out, which isn't all that often, is I love eating salmon. I love fishing for salmon, actually, but I don't eat it at all anymore. And the reason for that is because of the issues that we have with salmon farming, which are somewhat parallel to the issues with salmon farming in North America, and the cause and effect between salmon farming and our wild stocks of salmon and sea trout. And at this moment in time, it's not possible for me to say, okay, salmon farmed from this particular farm in this sea loch are not having a negative impact on the wild stocks. And so my answer to that is that I just won't eat it, in the hope that if more people would do that, and I talk about it, we've talked about it on the podcast. It's not just a solitary stance. That's kind of silly, especially if you're trying to change something. Is that if more people do that, then the companies will listen to the consumers because they're no longer buying it, and that's a conscious choice, because I'm not happy not only with their impact on the environment and the other species that share it, but also because of the animal welfare within those fish farms.
Yeah.
So it's a small example, but I think if people thought about these things a little bit more, the same is true of beef, the same is true of pork, then we'd probably facilitate more change.
I wonder how many people who are listening to the show right now, because the vast majority of my listeners are in the US. I think the next largest population is in the UK, then Australia, then South Africa, and then moving on to kind of non-English speaking countries. Although I do have listeners all over the world. I think I recently saw that I had listeners in Saudi, which welcome Saudi listeners. But I'm wondering how many, and within the US, when you break down by city, it's New York and Los Angeles, which are the two largest cities. And I wonder how many people are taken aback or maybe a little bit surprised to hear a hunter talking in this way about...
Well, do you think that's not normal?
I think it's probably very normal, and I think
you think it is?
Very many people don't know that that's normal. Okay. And I think that's part of why it was so important to me that while I'm here, that I had a chance to be able to talk to you on the show. So what I tend to do on the show, which I'm guilty of doing right now, is diving headfirst into the deep end with zero context. So I want to take a second to...
because we were talking about the hunting clients, but we've already ended up on a massive tangent. We're talking about salmon now. We were in South Africa a minute ago.
I love it, though. I love it. And
it's exactly the same for us. Don't worry.
I think it is important, too, to be able to have these kinds of conversations and allow them to meander. But fuck, I think I got bit by something on my elbow.
If you've only been bitten once while you're here, you're doing well. I've got like 3 on my leg, 2 on my back, 1 under my arm.
And I've not worn bug spray once. No DEET.
The first night we were here, in this hotel complex, I was at war with a mosquito for the entire night. Eventually, I hid underneath that one sheet because it was too hot for the duvet. I just pulled it over and clamped down, and I could hear him buzzing around, and I had given up trying to kill him.
I told you should have turned on your air conditioner, but you refused.
My air conditioning didn't work. There was no remote control in my room for the air conditioner.
We won't have that conversation on air. So kind of rewinding a bit to get a bit more context. Part of the reason that I was so interested in speaking to you is that you are a filmmaker who focuses quite a bit on wildlife and conservation. The conference that we are here attending, I was invited to speak at a very different conference than I think usually be invited to speak at, because the context was communicating science and communicating scientific principles. They translate so readily to the core principles that are being discussed at this conference. So tell me a little bit, and the listeners a little bit, from your perspective, what is the CIC? What is this conference that's going on right now, and why are we here?
Council for International Conservation. Mm-hmm. Why are we here? I think what was amazing about the sessions that we were in,
which was kind of like a journalism.
Yeah, it was like a symposium before the main sort of council event, which we've been sat in today, which was a series of speeches and discussions about the state. Well, today particularly was the state of wildlife and wildlife conservation in Africa, with a focus on hunting and its role within these sort of management principles, and the issues that they face globally in contextualizing that to a wider public and why it's important. Because as most people will be aware, and I'm sure almost all of your listeners, that there's a lot of controversy when it comes to hunting in Africa, particularly big game. Like
Absolutely.
Your elephants and lion. It's been well publicized in the papers. So I think we were here. I was actually at the first symposium in Switzerland 3 years ago. And the topic then was the future of hunting. What is the future of hunting? And if you are somebody who believes in hunting as a tool and as part of heritage and culture within certain countries, it was becoming quite apparent, or it has become quite apparent over the last few years, that it's increasingly under threat of being shut down, as we've seen, particularly in Africa. Most of the hunting shut down in Botswana.
Yeah.
And does this matter? Is it important? And is it important to people, and is it important to wildlife? So we were kind of discussing that 3 years ago. I wasn't at the one last year. And then this year, I think they've called it Crossroads, haven't they? So
Something
this is
like
sort of
that. Wildlife at a crossroads?
Yeah, the crossroad point of... it's still really tied to the future of hunting and its relevance and importance. And is it important in the future of wildlife management? And from my perspective, what was really great in the symposium, which happened the day before the main conference started, was actually having people like you and Jason and the journalists from Austria in the room, able to converse and discuss in an open-minded manner and ask us questions as the hunting community that we maybe don't want to tackle ourselves. Because I think it allows us to rationalize arguments in a far better way when you're not having internal discussions.
Yeah, when you're not sort of in the echo chamber,
you're
maybe
not,
preaching to
you're
the
not
choir.
slapping each other on the back because you kind of all know you're using the same terminology all the time. But when you have someone from a science background who is genuinely inquisitive and wants to listen and learn, that was incredibly valuable. And I think that actually was is the main purpose of those symposiums. It is to try and generate discussion in a way that possibly hasn't been had before, so that we can come to a consensus as to the actions which need to be taken for the future. And what I was always trying to bring it back to in the discussion that we had on the first day was that whatever we do, it has to be centered around the wildlife. And that has to come first. But obviously, we understand from the complexities of discussions that we had that involves so many moving parts. And critically, it involves the people in the countries living in the same environment as that wildlife.
So I think coming into this, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't really... I probably had tons of preconceived notions, but I tried to come into it with as open mind as possible. But I will say that when my friends and family asked me what I was going to Namibia for, I told them I was coming to a conservation conference, which is not untrue, but I never mentioned the word hunting. Solely because I think that many questions would be raised that I wasn't sure how to answer. And
because you didn't think you had the background or tools to answer?
Well, and I think that these sort of stigma, the stereotypes were so heavy that I wouldn't really know how to engage at that point in time. And it became increasingly apparent to me as I was sitting and listening to these incredibly knowledgeable people speak, and especially yesterday when we took a kind of a day trip to a conservancy up north, it became increasingly apparent to me why it's so critically important to have these conversations, which is why ultimately I wanted to have you on the show. So to kind of take a step back, I was taking some notes today during some of the panels, and one of the things that one of the women mentioned when we were listening earlier was this idea that the first question that everybody asks, because I want to take it back to the kind of most naive listener who sees hunting as diametrically opposed to conservation, or who has never heard of hunting in the same sentence as conservation. I'm going to take it all the way back to this conversation where you say, okay, we're looking at the numbers and we see that on the whole, and we'll talk about how this is not the case region to region and country to country, but on the whole, wildlife is declining at an alarming rate.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And then you say, okay, wildlife is declining at an alarming rate, so what should we do? We should stop. We should make sure wildlife is not killed.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, we make sure wildlife is not killed. And then all of a sudden, there are all of these downstream effects that we never thought of from our comfortable homes in the United States and in the United Kingdom. We start to see all of this human-wildlife conflict in these areas where individuals live in direct connection with wildlife. And we start to see that there are massive economic impacts when all of a sudden no wildlife is harmed or killed anymore. And the question starts to become, why do I keep hearing about hunting? Why is it that boots on the ground, which I would never have known if I hadn't come here in person and sat and spoken with people who run conservancies and people who work for the Namibian government on critical conservation efforts? I would never have known that hunting is like a massive part of that conversation. So that's really the crux of what I want to talk with you about as a person who wears the hat of a kind of a Scottish traditionalist hunter, and also the hat of a very modern, very progressive conservationist. And you know very intimately that these two things kind of cannot exist without one another. But I think very few people know that across the world.
Yeah, it seems like a contradiction.
Absolutely.
The idea that you would kill wildlife to save it. It's important to first of all say that is not always necessary or the case.
Sure.
And I think that's something that the hunting community have been guilty of, is they hunt to conserve.
Shoot to save.
Shoot to save. And in quite an aggressive manner as well. Not really willing to listen and engage with the outside world because we're right. And we've always been right.
Yeah.
And
we don't want to be wrong.
Yeah, and it's just a shame that no one else understands us. And that's just silly. I think that's a lot of the reason that we have the problem that we have now when trying to explain hunting as a management tool for conservation.
Sure.
Is that this has been going on for a very, very long time.
Hunting or conservation or both?
Well, both. But hunting as a tool for conservation has been going on for decades and decades. But we never really talked about it. We just kind of got on with it.
Yeah.
And didn't feel the need to discuss it. But we live in very different times now, where people, I think, are more curious. They want to understand what is going on in the world and how resources are being used, because we are becoming more environmentally conscious, even if we're not necessarily acting environmentally conscious.
Sure.
And so when you tell somebody that Botswana, for example, the conference that's happening as we record this podcast, want to reopen elephant hunting, it becomes quite a hard thing to understand because, as we all know, elephants are endangered, aren't they?
Right, and as we all know, it's fundamentally inhumane to kill an elephant.
Yeah, or questionably any other animal, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. But if you look at, I am no expert on the Botswana situation, but I have an overview, I have a grasp of the situation there. They closed pretty much all the hunting a couple of years back, but they have a very, very high elephant population. And the problem with a very, very high elephant population, or indeed population of any animal, so I'm going to draw some comparisons now with Scotland, which is my home country, and one hopefully listeners can maybe grasp a little bit better than an elephant, is that if we don't manage, so we have no natural predators for deer in Scotland or in the UK. Elephant also have no natural predators. There is, I think, a pride of lions somewhere in Africa that have worked out how to take down small elephants, but that is not the norm.
Yeah.
So the only real predator they have is man. If we don't manage the populations of deer in the Highlands of Scotland, they have detrimental impacts on the ecosystem they live in, the heather moorland, which then has a whole chain effect to everything else that shares that environment with them.
Yeah, this is also the case in the United States. This is, I think, one of the central reasons that I grew up in Texas hunting deer with my family.
Okay,
There were too many deer. And it was important from an ecological perspective. I mean, we also like to eat deer, and we enjoyed hunting growing up, but it was important from an ecological perspective to maintain the deer population at a level that was consistent with the carrying capacity of the land.
Exactly. And that's the key. So if you look at the elephant situation in Botswana, even when I was there 10 years ago, hunting in the Caprivi, which is just a narrow strip of Namibia on the other side from the Botswana border, you could see even then the elephant destruction. They're a very, very destructive animal to have. I mean, they're huge.
And when you say destruction, I think the first thing people think is like, how could they destroy their own habitat?
Which is a fair comment.
But what you're talking about is destruction of agricultural land, destruction of human
Actually, I'm not.
dwellings. What are you talking about?
That does exist. So that is more the wildlife conflict with humans.
Sure.
When I was referring to elephant destruction, it was just in terms of their own environment.
Because there's too many of them.
Yeah, and the other species that share that.
Sure. So they'll eat everything within
and they knock down
sight.
every tree. And so to paint the picture, I'm sitting for the first time. I'd never been to the Caprivi. I'm 20 years old. The most incredible place. I'm watching elephant over the river on this lush island, and the grass is up to their armpits, and they're eating away, and it's awesome. And there's sounds, and there's hippo, and you can hear lion. You look over onto the other side. So I was on the Namibian side, which, as you've gathered while we've been here, as a country manages their wildlife very well, especially by comparison to some other African countries. And they really have a grasp on the quota systems and the conservancies. So up there, they were giving quotas by survey every year for the number of hippo and crocodile and elephants, buffalo, and everything else that could be hunted within those conservancies to make sure that it was a sustainable offtake.
So that means in an effort to ensure that not so many are hunted that it is damaging to the population, but enough are hunted that the population doesn't grow too large in size.
Exactly. And we can expand on this later, but there was all the economic benefits to the local community as well. And they had systems in place where you had to employ one of the local rangers who was with you the whole time, and all the meat from those particular hunts that I was on went to local communities, and we were there helping them cut it. It was the most. I've got some really great pictures of them all cutting up these hippo that were essentially the meat is given to the local villagers, and just like within a matter of hour of it being put up onto the bank, there's like 100 people there, all getting there. They had this amazing way. I didn't fully understand how they shared out the meat. I mean, that's another story.
But so that there's no kind of infighting. Everybody.
Yeah, they must have had a hierarchy for it.
Yeah.
But I didn't quite grasp, because I didn't speak the language. I didn't quite grasp how that worked. But there was a very clear hierarchy of how the meat was distributed. And it's something I would love to learn, more about, and I will when I have the opportunity again. But going back to the elephants, when you looked across to the Botswana side, even then, you could see that it wasn't the same lush green environment that was supporting masses of wildlife as on the Namibian side. And that situation, since they banned elephant hunting there, has only got worse.
Yeah.
And that is paralleled, maybe a place that more people will be familiar with, Kruger National Park. Probably beside Yellowstone, one of the most famous national parks in the world. A lot of people don't know that they have a serious elephant problem, but they don't really want to tackle the issue because the issue is very unpalatable. And that is that Kruger National Park has too many elephants. They are negative. They have begun to negatively impact the environment that they live in, which is not good for them, and it's not good for the sable and the impala and the roan and every other antelope that needs to eat from that ecosystem. And we haven't even started to talk about all the small little bugs and lizards and stuff that most people don't really care about.
Sure.
So what do you do about that? So you really only have two choices. You either cull a population.
And that means to literally go out and kill these animals and either let them kind of rot in place or incinerate them.
No, that almost never happens.
So they do feed them to the local communities when they cull.
100%. I personally do not know of an instance where that has ever happened. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that has never happened, because that's a
And you're saying that specifically for countries on the African continent?
I mean, globally. I can
tell you that culling of deer in America does not result in feeding the population.
No, but it will. But they're not left in the field. I'm just making that distinction.
But oftentimes they are incinerated.
I don't know.
Yeah. Simply because there's not as much of a taste, I think, for the game meat.
But is that not because in North America you can't sell game meat?
You're right. There are a lot of political implications there as well.
So we, and I'll revert back to the elephants now, but so we can sell game meat from the wild. So it doesn't have to be farmed to be able to sell it into our food chain in the UK.
Yeah.
So all of this surplus, so say on the estate by us, they're taking out, say, 400 females in a year to balance the population with habitat impact. The vast majority of that is going to a game dealer, and the game dealer is processing that, and it goes into the food chain in either local butchers or in our supermarkets. So there's nothing being left in the field just because you need to reduce the population for the environmental impact. There's a full circle of usage here.
It reduces, I guess, I don't know if waste is the right word, but it does raise a question, which I think is a fundamental one, probably for the people listening, which is, what is the difference between culling and hunting?
It can be the same thing.
Okay.
So let's focus on the elephant issue. So
Sure.
what the ideal situation there would be the Botswana government, through their wildlife departments, say we need to cull X number of elephants to reinstate the balance between the environment and their population. We haven't talked about the potential of actually moving animals, but we can deal with that relocating, which is a big thing here. And I can give you I mentioned it at the start with the moving of animals to the DRC. But let's just assume that's off the table because no one else wants the elephants. Yeah,
or let's say that there's economically,
so that's just
we can't afford to move.
So we're going to cull them. The best case scenario for that is, instead of having a government-employed person or rangers, or obviously multiple people if you're talking about hundreds of elephants, which they will be, going out and just simply shooting the elephants in the most efficient manner possible, and then processing the meat or giving the meat to in Africa, meat gets processed. If local people know that there's meat, they will come and they will process it. So it's not even like it's a big logistic operation, really. You could do that. But what do you get out of it? What you get out of that is you get a redressing of the balance, and you provide meat to the local community. But what if you could bring in hunters, which largely speaking would be foreign hunters, because that tends to be where the money is, who would pay to do exactly the same job, the same animals being selected would be shot, but they also inject hundreds of thousands of dollars into the economy and the local areas. What is the better scenario in that situation? If you accept that it has to happen, I would rather see, irrespective, and this is where the conversation gets muddied. So irrespective of the motivations of the people, of the hunters, because that's a whole separate discussion. Yeah. Let's just put that in a little box for now.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. So irrespective of their motivations, I'd rather have them in the country shooting the elephants under guidance. It's not like it's a free-for-all. Yeah. They're there with professional hunters and the rangers and everyone else.
With a permit issued by the government.
100%. It's all legal.
Paying loads of money.
You're talking about, per elephant, tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah. So, and that's just for the animal.
Yeah, think about all the other ways they're infusing the economy.
Yeah, that's not including accommodation. That's not including government taxes. That's not including the hiring of trackers. There's a lot of economic spin-off.
The hiring of a lot of local people to engage in this.
Yeah. I'd rather see that option, because it seems wasteful not to use that.
And the way you're talking about this, it's not a hypothetical. This is something that happens in many African countries.
Oh, yeah.
And this is, to, I think, the Western ears that are listening to this right now, what we refer to, or historically have referred to, as trophy hunting.
Yeah, that's what that would be the term, yeah.
Now there are efforts to kind of rebrand and maybe call it conservation hunting.
Yeah, we heard that from actually, and that's not that term has come from this local community in Namibia up north. That was the first time I'd heard that, to be honest.
And the interesting thing is, it's smart. Obviously, it's referring to the exact same process, but it in a way, I think it's very smart, very kind of savvy marketing, because these local people in these local conservancies know that when certain people in the West hear the phrase trophy hunting, it's
very negative,
unpalatable to them. Yeah. Because they don't understand the realities of the economic issues on the ground. And they don't understand the realities of the ecological issues on the ground.
And we touched on it, but we skipped past it. There's also the animal, the wildlife-human conflict.
Absolutely, which we haven't really gotten into at all.
And it's so important to consider that, because if you don't give enough weight to the effect of people who live with the wildlife. And it doesn't have to be elephants. We can be talking about deer in the highlands, because it's paralleled with the crofts, like on the Isle of Skye all the time. A friend of mine who's a gamekeeper, a stalker up there, I wonder if I should clarify those terms. So gamekeeper, like ranger,
like a park
custodian,
ranger.
like kind of, but for like an estate, for a ranch.
Okay.
So we use the gamekeeper, stalker kind of interchangeably. Stalker just being a hunter, but it's a term that they use there as a hunter, like a guide.
So a gamekeeper is somebody who's kind of responsible for ensuring the numbers and the health and the kind of general. General.
They're looking after they tend to be looking after all of the hunting concerns in an area.
Okay.
But if they also, this is the complication of it, if they also hunt deer, then they're known as a stalker.
Right.
It's just
and stalker, that sounds super fucking creepy.
doesn't it?
Yeah. But what you're
when
actually talking about. When I
said it to Tyler for the first time, I was like, I think we need to clarify that.
So stalker meaning that in an effort to be an effective hunter.
Yeah, exactly, because you're stalking your prey.
Yeah.
That's where it comes from.
You literally are learning how the prey, how they live.
Yeah.
Where do I find them?
You are a hunter.
Yeah.
So you are stalking your prey.
You are much like a predator.
Like any predator would do, yeah. So there they have the issue of crofters, which are like small holdings.
Okay, I'm very... Crafters?
No, crofter.
Crofter. So you are saying crofter.
Yeah, croft.
This is not a word I know.
It's a historic... I am not that well versed in this, although I have been around it a lot in the Isle of Skye, where it's pretty evident. And you see it still up and down the west coast of Scotland. And they were essentially small holdings, where people had a very small amount of livestock, largely for subsistence and a bit of trade.
Okay.
But we're talking back like hundreds of years in the history of Scotland. There used to be crofts everywhere, but there isn't now. Now it's much more large-scale agriculture. But where they do still exist, they have wildlife conflict there too, where this one friend of mine, who's the head stalker up on a Gaelic-speaking estate on the Isle of Skye, he has them phoning all the time saying, the deer are in my garden. Or the deer in my paddock, which could be 30 acres, eating my grass.
Yeah.
But they're your deer. You need to come and do something about it. Now, that's not too dissimilar to the elephants have knocked over my fence, or they're eating my trees, or they're eating my grazing that my goats want to eat here.
Yeah, and
it's more destructive.
Sure.
But you can see the parallels.
But you see it in the US too, even with predators. We heard today a story about a lion that ate a small child, and imagine the heartache and the frustration and the difficulty of the local people who, periodically do lose their own to
more dogs.
Yeah,
pets.
Yeah, or pets. And you think to Los Angeles and people losing their pets to coyotes. You think farmers losing their alpaca to mountain lions. It's not any. Or
it's still a conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's still a wildlife conflict.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we think about the way that we manage those things in the U.S., that these farmers, for example, are often given permission to hunt a predator that is threatening their livestock. And people are like, yeah, okay. Sometimes people get up in arms about it. I think the same kind of controversy exists there. But then we think of individuals who are living oftentimes in poverty, in incredibly rural areas, that are surrounded by, and this was reinforced to us so many times yesterday when we were visiting this conservancy in the north. And I keep calling it this conservancy in the north because the name is literally unpronounceable.
I can't pronounce it. I looked at it just before coming in here and I still couldn't quite
put it together. When we asked our guide how to pronounce it.
It's near Etosha.
Yeah, it's near Etosha. And when we asked our guide how to pronounce it, she said, don't try. Because the local language is a click language.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's very difficult.
So we would definitely butcher it.
Absolutely. So this conservancy in the north, they kept reiterating, and I think that this is kind of in many ways the Namibian way, that these conservancies are not fenced areas. These are people living in the same region by choice because they care to be shepherds of the wildlife.
And they use that term, which I really liked, actually, shepherds.
Yeah. And they choose to live near to these magnificent creatures that are also incredibly powerful, knowing that there's a risk.
But that risk has to be offset, and this is the consideration that we always need to think about, is that where you have wildlife conflict with humans, if you don't give the wildlife a value to those local people, then the wildlife will no longer exist there. And it won't exist because they will eventually take matters into their own hands. The wildlife has to be worth more alive to them It's compounded here in Africa, where there is poverty and people are hungry. Mm-hmm. It'll just disappear. It'll disappear because they, and I want to be very clear about differentiating terms here. They will kill it illegally because it won't be under a permit system, and they will poison it. They will do something, and there's loads and loads of evidence to show this.
Yeah.
And to some extent, you can't blame them.
No, I mean, I think that that's the first thing that many people would raise is this question of like, who am I to tell somebody tens of thousands of miles from home what they can do in their backyard when I have no concept of what it's like to live amongst lions and hyenas and elephants. No.
I mean, like in Scotland, people are pissed because a deer's in their back garden. So what happens if an elephant walks over and destroys your entire crop, which is how you're supposed to survive next year?
And drinks all of your water that you've had stockpiled and potentially threatens the safety of your children.
Yeah. So this is where hunting in Africa in particular, in this very visceral way, where we're looking at quite literally life and death, plays a really crucial role, where the communities are able to put value on keeping wildlife rather than it being a problem to them, because they know that it's a real asset and a valuable asset, where there can be compensation for crop damage, where there can be compensation for fences being knocked over, where they are comfortable living in those situations because they know that in the long term, they're going to see a greater economic benefit to their areas. If they don't have that incentive, it just disappears. And we've seen that time and time again. Kenya, I almost don't want to use the Kenya example because it's used so often, but it's a very easy example for me to use. Kenya has awesome wildlife, but it's in very small areas. I mean, relatively speaking they're huge areas, relatively speaking to the entire country. But they've lost masses and masses of their wildlife since they banned hunting in the 1970s. So where it's protected, where it's a park where the tourists go, it's great. But what about the rest of the country? Well, most of the rest of the country now is used for cattle farms because the wildlife was worth more dead than it was alive because it was competition. And that's both lion competition for actually eating cattle and also just grazing pressure. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be a predator. And we forget that, we're so detached from it because most people have experienced it on that level before.
Absolutely. I mean, people are trying to imagine and make ethical, moral distinctions based on a gut reaction to something that they're very emotionally triggered by without really understanding the nuance because they just don't have that insight. And why should they? Because they've never been to those places and the information, unfortunately, in many cases, the local and the international media simply isn't translated appropriately. And I think that the statement that you made about these things being in this situation where hunting has been banned, being worth more dead than alive is a really important one that bears repeating. And I think it comes down something that was mentioned today that I wrote down in my notes, that this really is a fundamental human rights issue as well. And I've noticed now that we've been talking for 45 minutes, so I want to take a quick break because I think we need to thank the sponsors of the show right now. But hold that thought because I would like to explore that concept in a little bit more detail when we return right after this break with Byron Pace. All right, everyone, I want to take a quick break from the show to thank the sponsors of this week's episode, starting with Calm. Now, of course, you've heard me talk about Calm several times in the past, and that's because it continues to be a really important part of my own personal life. Calm's the #1 app to help you reduce anxiety and stress, to help you sleep better, and to help you get started on meditation or continue your meditative journey. It's great for beginners, but it's also really good for people who have been doing it for a very long time. Calm has several different options within the app. app. So there are a lot of different types of meditation. Some of them are very guided, which is great if you've never done it before. You're a little overwhelmed with the concept of sitting down and being really introspective, quieting your mind. But then there are also some that are less guided for people who have been meditating for a while and would prefer to be able to, I don't know, go a little bit deeper. But there's so much more than that. There are sleep stories, which are like, bedtime stories for grownups, which I love. I think there's a kids section as well, though. So it's not just for grownups. And my favorite is the section with calming music that's divided into activities. So there's focus music, there's nature music, there's relaxing music, and of course, there's sleep music. I use Calm every day. I know you're going to love it. You just got to try it. So right now, all you've got to do is go to calm.com/nerdy and you'll get 25% off of a Calm premium subscription, something that I have, that I love. I actually got a lifetime subscription. Yes, I'm that into it. And you can try it out just by going to that website. Again, that's calm, calm.com/nerdy for 25% off unlimited access. I also want to thank Every Key for their support of the show. Now, Every Key is an incredible product that's going to help you with one of the biggest, most frustrating things that we come across utilizing technology today. I mean, for me personally, at least, that is forgetting all of your passwords and logins, especially when you work for big corporations or you utilize logins for organizations that require you to reset it like every 6 weeks, every 4 weeks. And they don't just let you add an exclamation point to the end. See, the fact that I said that out loud means that that is not an appropriate way to come up with a new password. You've got so many different accounts, so many devices. It's really difficult to manage everything. But Every Key is really going to help you with that. So here's how it works. It's a single device that ensures you never have to remember another password or device login again. It's a Bluetooth key that actually unlocks your devices, like your laptop, your phone, your tablet, whenever you're close to it, and locks it back down again when you walk away. Eventually, the technology is going to allow you to unlock your car and your house as well. But it also generates new secure passwords for you, like actually secure passwords, not dictionary words with, your street address after them or the name of your pet. And it remembers your current passwords and it logs you in automatically. And here's another cool thing. If you ever lose Every Key, you can easily freeze it to make sure no one else can use it. So no more passwords, no more worries about hacks. Every Key gives you security and it unlocks your peace of mind. You can try it right now. You've just got to go to everykey.com and use the promo code NERDY20. That's NERDY with the number 20 to purchase Every Key today and get 20% off. Again, that's everykey.com and use the promo code NERDY20 for 20% off. All right, guys, let's get back to the show. All right, we are back with Byron Pace. We're sitting here in a hotel room in Windhoek, Namibia, talking about wildlife conservation in Africa and the world and kind of across the world as a whole. And specifically within the context of its relationship to trophy hunting. Something that I think prior to this trip, I was probably, like most of you listening, appalled by. I did not... Just
the notion of it.
Yeah, I did not have any concept. When I think of a trophy hunter, I think of a rich American who has a hunger for flesh, who has like a small dick, and is very interested in proving to the world that it's much larger than it is.
Is he probably fat as well?
He might be. We think often of people killing things from helicopters or from the backs of Jeeps, and we think of holding up a pelt that's bloody and sharing it on Twitter or Facebook. Mm-hmm. But the other side of that we don't see, and sometimes there are people for whom that is the way it is. But
what you have described does exist.
Yeah, of course it does.
And this is this again is one of the unfortunate things I think about the hunting community, is that there hasn't been an acceptance that there are actually horrible people within the community.
I see. But you want to wash the whole community. Yeah. We're all just fundamentally interested in conservation.
But it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's silly. To suggest that.
But the idea is, does it matter? Because whether
that's the great question.
Individual motivation is shit, is the $60,000 that he's contributing to kill that lion going to such a fundamentally important cause when it would take how many photographic tourists
we saw some of those numbers today.
Yeah, to infuse, I think I actually took a picture, to infuse the same amount of money into the economy. Let me look at my photos here because, that one was quite striking to me.
Well, that's the comparison that's always made, is that we can replace it with photographic tourism.
Yeah, so here this image says privately owned protected area, so specifically talking about those regions. Photographic tourists, there are 24,000 in wherever in a certain amount of time in this one region.
Yeah, it was in South Africa. Actually, I know that was they were referring to Timbavati, which is a private reserve on the edge of Kruger National Park.
Okay, 24,000 photographic tourists, making up 17% of the total income. Only 54 hunters. So 24,000 to 54, making up 61% of the total income.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And you think about the footprint.
Well, that's
the ecological
the big thing,
footprint, of those people. 54 people coming in and infusing that much money and hunting animals that in many cases, not all, but in many cases would need to be removed anyway.
Well, certainly there. It's all part of a very stringent... I've actually been to Timbavati by coincidence. It was one of my... So certainly there, it's under, very strict control. And they are only... You got to remember that where you have ethical concern, which is most, not all, but the vast majority, and even without that, a long-term view to your business, if your business is hunting, you're not going to want to do anything to that environment or population of species that you're hunting that is going to be detrimental to it.
Yeah, you want to be able to continue to hunt them.
Yeah. There is a huge incentive to do your absolute utmost to make sure that population is in the best health it can be, not just for today, but for the next generation if you're passing on your business to your kids.
But again, going back to, and this has many tentacles, going back to the image that we opened up with of the kind of bastard hunter, he may not give a shit.
Yeah.
He may be only thinking about himself, and he may be only thinking about the next kill. And he may not be thinking about, in any respects, about the larger web that his actions are a part of. But does it matter if he is used as a tool for conservation, whether he is in on that or not? And so just I want to mention a couple of more statistics from one of the presentations today. Money that one hunter, so this is basically the translation of those numbers that I gave you. Money that one hunter brings into the region is equivalent to 1,600 times that of a photographic tourist.
Crazy.
And the environmental footprint, like we said, of the photographic tourism is much higher. And one thing that we didn't mention is that many of these regions that hunters will go to stalk and kill an animal are just not regions that a photographic tourist would be willing to step foot in because they're not beautiful. They're quite difficult. There's no lodge. They're expensive. Yeah. There's no lodge nearby. You may have to hunt, you may have to camp. You may not be able to shower for a few days. And that might not be something that somebody on vacation wants to be a part of. Yet those areas still require stewardship, and those areas still require an infusion of funds.
I always think it's important to ask yourself what happens in the vacuum. This is something I mentioned in the symposium, is that there is really very little land that isn't utilized by someone for something right now. So and it doesn't even have to be hunting that we're talking about, if you remove whatever the land use is now as it stands, what replaces it? Now, in some instances, that might be a very positive change. It could be intensive cattle farming, and you remove that and you turn it into an ecotourism area, and now you get the bush back, you get the wildlife back. That could be, that could be positive. But in an area where tourists don't want to go, and it's a hunting concession, and it's funded in that way, what happens if tomorrow that shuts down? What replaces it? There are still rural communities, very rural communities in some instances, living in those areas.
Yeah.
So
But we
they
think of
still
as like
have to
these
do
indigenous
something.
tribes
Yeah.
are living in these very remote regions.
And they will utilize the environment around them, understandably.
as they, I mean, many of us would believe should have every right to do.
Yeah. But with the situation of the hunting concessions, they're able to benefit from the utilization of the wildlife in a sustainable manner.
And when
that's
that is regulated.
When it is regulated, yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And what your point about does it matter the reason that somebody hunts? Funny enough, that is the conclusion that actually the phrasing that I very often use when I'm having debates. Or I certainly did use it. I've come to question it a little bit. And I formed that same argument. As long as the greater conservation consequences for hunting taking place in an area, and normally when I'm having these discussions, it is over some sort of emotional animal like an elephant or a lion, because that's what most people get up in arms about. Few people are that worried about a deer being killed.
Yeah.
Is just understand the economic benefits to the area. And the fact that there's hunting there means that they can pay for anti-poaching patrols, and it's good for the environment. Trust me, it is. It doesn't matter that guy's a complete dick, because I think he is too. Because you're right, he doesn't care. All he wants to go and do is put something on his wall and show all his mates when he get home. But it doesn't matter because he is still shooting the right animal under the stewardship of the professional hunter and under the correct regulation and licenses from the government. So it shouldn't matter. The reality of the world that we live in is that it kind of does matter, because that is,
in many people's eyes, it's the only thing that matters.
It is.
Yeah.
Which is, I think it's a little narrow-minded to think that is the only thing that matters, because it's not looking at the bigger picture, but I totally understand it. And it was actually Shane Mahoney that picked me up on this when I asked him the question in an interview I did with him maybe a year ago. And I posed exactly the same question to him. Phrased in the same way. I said, does it matter the moral reasons why someone wants to kill something if the consequences are positive for the environment and the wildlife? And he said, it absolutely does matter. And it matters because, as we see time and time again, it is that moral exception that the wider public take that actually have downstream effects. And it's that ends up shutting hunting areas down. Because people can't wrap their heads around the idea that somebody would want to do it. Because
there's an outcry oftentimes from the West, and so much political pressure and capital comes into the conversation that regions are actually pressured into changing the laws.
Yeah, and that's what happened in Botswana.
The unfortunate thing is that, I was literally about to say, before I made that statement, that kind of summary statement, that unfortunately we can't really legislate morality. We can only legislate practicality, but we do see moral conviction leading to legislation quite often. The thing is, that hunter who's a dick, who is a problem because he's a PR problem more than anything else, we cannot force him to do it for the right reasons. And we can't have some sort of morality test to decide who gets to hold the gun.
At the end of the day, that animal is going to die. If you accept the management principles that we've been talking about, which is the reality on the ground, someone is going to shoot that animal because of all the reasons that we've discussed. As long as it's done in an ethical manner where the minimal suffering occurs to the animal, which most responsible people would do, and even if the guy's a bit of a knob, you would hope that, well, he would have to, because he's not there by himself. He's being guided, so he's not going to be allowed to. It's not a free-for-all.
Because let's be clear, if he were there by himself, shooting what he wanted to shoot without regulation, without permits,
that's poaching.
He's a fucking poacher.
Yeah.
And that's
different.
That's illegal.
It's illegal.
And it's highly punishable. Yeah. And it's something that across the board, whether you're a hunter, whether you're a government official, whether you're an indigenous person, we're not okay with.
No.
Poaching is not okay. And I think it's maybe something that we didn't say early on, that we didn't make a clear distinction. We are talking about legal hunting that's done for conservation and sustainability purposes.
Yeah. Hunting and poaching are two different things.
Very different things.
When it is done legally, It is not always hunting. It could be culling. And we can flesh that out.
Yeah.
But when it's done illegally, it is only one thing, and that is poaching.
And
that is in the same bucket as rhino horn poaching, as ivory poaching, as pangolin, which is not even a species you hunt.
But whether that flesh is consumed or that horn is sawed off and that carcass is left to die, if it's done illegally, it's still poaching. And I think this is a hard truth, even for me to come to grips with, that if in a local community that's hungry and that has excessive wildlife that's become a burden, if they don't have the permits and they've not worked out with the local authorities a legal way to kill that animal, that's poaching too.
It is, yeah. And in Central Africa, meat poaching, so we're not talking about extra products like ivory or rhino horn. Meat poaching is one of the biggest problems, and it's from hungry people. Well, let me qualify that. It's largely by hungry people, but there is also an element of it that they're doing it for vast profit.
Absolutely.
Because they are mass poaching meat and then selling it in markets.
But I also think there's also a big difference, and this is it comes back to this moral question. I'm going a little off out of left field here, but I promise we'll come back. It comes back to this fundamental question, this moral kind of thought experiment that is it stealing if you're doing it to feed your family. But also, is there really a fundamental difference between somebody killing an animal because their family is hungry to give them food, or somebody killing an animal to make the money that they need to feed their family?
Yeah.
Because they're selling it.
Where do you draw the line?
Downstream.
How much money is too much money?
Well, and it really becomes this conversation that I think we've seen quite often in the West, especially in the United States, about drug trafficking, and that we have a long historic law enforcement problem of going after the vulnerable people who are selling small quantities of drugs in order to make a living because they don't have any other options, and treating them the same as a trafficking kingpin who's actually, moving in pounds and pounds, kilos and kilos of drugs, who has an armed militia behind them and who is making incredibly immoral decisions, and yet somehow they're treated the same way. And so I think with the poaching problem, and this is not what this episode is about, and maybe we'll be able to get into this in another episode, but there is also a difference, and we talked to an anti-poaching, what do you call him? I mean,
he was like the head of an anti-poaching unit.
Yeah. I mean, he was
he was a tough dude.
He was a tough dude. And he was so sensitive and so empathic to the idea that the guy on the ground is not the same as the trafficker who's bringing this meat to a warlord, or who's bringing this horn across into China for traditional Chinese medicine purposes, or whatever purposes. So, I mean, I think we should be clear on that, but also that's not really the core conversation that we're having right now.
Yeah, that's a whole podcast by itself.
Absolutely. But it does speak to what I said before we broke for the break, which is that there is a fundamental human rights issue that I think often becomes lost in the conversation. And I'm not now talking about poaching, but I am now talking about the idea that it's very easy, again, sitting in your air-conditioned apartment in the West and eating your, $1.99 hamburger, to say, well, how could these indigenous people possibly be comfortable killing an elephant?
Or allowing, because they probably wouldn't be, if we were talking about the hunting scenario,
Absolutely.
I suppose they would be seen as complicit by allowing it to happen.
And how dare they, like this, there's this indignant attitude that you see quite often, because we use the word a lot. An elephant is a romantic animal. And, Jason Goldman, that's who we've been referencing, who's been on the show several times, so you know him by now. He made such an insightful comment that his 2.5-year-old niece can name an elephant and a lion and a rhinoceros long before she can name local California wildlife.
Whitetail or something.
Yeah. But when it really comes down to it, I think that the mistake that's often made when we talk about placing value on a life is that in the West, we sometimes put more value on the animal's life than on the human being that lives alongside it. And
they're so linked, humans and wildlife. And that's the issue with the sort of urban view that we have, is we're no longer part of the environment anymore.
Even though we are.
But we view it at our window. We live in comfortable houses, and we have this two-dimensional view. And in the greater wilderness, it's through a television screen.
Wild is something where we are not.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's something that's unspoiled by man, which is the most naive.
Yeah.
I mean, we have been carving out the landscape for 200,000 years. I mean, that's what human beings do. It's how we've existed. And whether we do it with concrete and irrigation, or whether we do it with these very rudimentary fences that we see, we saw all over the Conservancy, people and wildlife coexist, and they always have, and they always will. I think we have this romantic image that there are these vast swaths of land in Africa where people just never lived.
And I think that's, that is probably one of the most important aspects of this conversation, is that human beings have impacted the planet so much now that the most irresponsible thing that we can do is what many people suggest, which is leave it alone.
Yeah, because we have to manage it.
We have to, because the alternative is so drastically negative that I don't even want to comprehend it. And most people don't really follow it through all the way. So they say, like the elephant issue, it's like, well, they were fine before. Yeah, well, they were fine before, but now we have countries. We have countries with fences and borders, and the migration routes of a lot of the elephants, spanned multiple countries in Africa. Guess what? A lot of the African countries are in conflict. So elephants are not stupid. They avoid conflict zones if they can manage it. So their migration routes are not the same as they used to be. There's loads of cattle farms everywhere. There's agriculture everywhere. To suggest that it can go back to the way it was, and we can allow wildlife to balance itself, doesn't work in a landscape where humans are still there.
And that's the entire landscape. And that's the thing that's so important to remember, because you mentioned they were fine before. Before fucking what?
Yeah,
like,
where are you
as long
starting?
as we've known of them, they weren't fine because we were involved in their lives. And human beings, unfortunately, are destructive. And yes, we can point to the existence of indigenous cultures around the world who had respect for wildlife and who managed to live harmoniously with wildlife.
But they were small populations of people.
Absolutely. And these were pre-colonial areas. And I mean, we saw it in the United States, and we have much to learn from Native American populations in the United States. And I think that it's imperative that we actually do listen to the lessons that they can teach us about how they've been stewards of the environment. But even their relationship with wildlife was a relationship. Mm-hmm. It wasn't I'll stay here and you stay there and nary, shall we meet?
Yeah. Very often we don't share a relationship with wildlife anymore. Mm-mm. And if we did, I think we'd be looking at a very different landscape. I think we would understand it better. One of the conclusions that I've come to increasingly is that one of the most environmentally responsible things that we can do is to utilize our wildlife and resources. But it should be without saying, it has to be in a sustainable manner. And I'd even go further than that what we should be striving for is not actually sustainability, but it should be an improvement in the populations and the environment that they live in.
Yeah.
We started talking about, I'm not quite sure when sustainability became the buzzword, but I mean, I think it's pretty much been within my lifetime, so maybe 15, 20 years. Sustainability is now the default position, or it bloody well should be, because why would we be taking any action in any aspect of industry or hunting or development that doesn't look at the sustainability of the environment that's happening in? I don't think we can support something that isn't sustainable.
Yeah.
So the next step is to say, well, what more can we do? And we do need to write some of the catastrophes that have happened in terms of environmental and wildlife management of the past, as indeed you guys have done in North America. Your market hunting, which was not a recreational hunting, it was basically just hunting for food, mass culling and slaughtering of food, actually, of the wildlife, was seen as an unexhaustible resource.
Absolutely, yeah.
And guess what it was?
Yeah,
you nearly lost all of it.
Just like oil has become across the globe.
But you fixed it.
Yeah.
It was realized in the early 1900s. It was realized, and without going into the masses of details, that became the North American model of conservation, because there was a realization that, we've nearly lost everything. There was only a few hundred bison left. I mean, that's crazy to think that that's how far it went before someone realized that they had to do something about it.
Our surveying techniques weren't very good back then.
But I think it serves as a really great case study that we are capable of facilitating a far better future.
Yeah.
If you think how far North America came in their conservation your conservation. It's because it's your country, just like it is everyone who lives there. Your conservation of the species, it's remarkable.
Yeah.
It's something that I hold up as a brilliant example of what can happen when people work together. And hunting plays a massive role in the North American model. And that's not to say, and this is a mistake people make, I think, all the time, that is not to say that, it's worked there, it's going to work somewhere else. But we can still learn from the principles of it. It's not to say that the exact model is, you can't relocate that to Namibia or South Africa or even Scotland, because they're a different place with different cultures, different people,
and
bigger or smaller
wildlife.
landscape, and different wildlife. But we can learn from the successes of it. So we can make a difference if we're prepared to work together. And that was the key in North America, was this reaching across the aisle and working together for a common goal. Even if maybe people didn't necessarily agree with the methods, the outcome was the positive outcome they wanted.
You're making people cry in their cars right now because they're thinking about the political landscape in North America, or specifically in the United States currently. And, that becomes the real question, doesn't it? Two things. You talked about how it shouldn't just be about stopping the hemorrhaging. At this point, it should be about kind of improving. But also we have to accept that there's going to be a new normal. And I think sometimes we spend so much time lamenting how far it's gotten that we forget that we can still get to a place that's okay, even if it's never going to be brilliant.
We can't turn the clock back.
No.
But we can learn from the past.
Absolutely. We can't ever. And the thing is, people always want to talk about getting back to where we were, but that's when there were 3 billion people on the planet? Well, I'm sorry, we don't have the habitat that we used to have.
No.
And it's a larger conversation that we can have about problems of population control. It's a completely different conversation, but the truth of the matter is that we live in the world that we live in right now. And I think it's hard for people to accept that. They want to often say, but what if? But I'm sorry, it just isn't. So what we have to do is come up with solutions now. And I think the central thing that you mentioned was that we have to be able to work together. And what we're saying here is NGOs, governments, local people, and yes, the hunting community. But so many people are so polarized by the emotional reaction that they have to hunting that they actually cause environmental damage at the scale. I mean, the best example for my listeners, if I know my audience as well as I think I do, the best metaphor that I can come to is the idea of golden rice and how Greenpeace completely shat all over it and millions of people potentially died because the GM technology that could have fed a population that was absolutely in famine was cock-blocked because environmentalists could not understand how important this was. They were fundamentally hung up on the the technology and they didn't like the idea of genetic modification. And I think that this is a very similar conversation. They're having an emotional reaction to something that's fundamentally necessary because it doesn't sit well with them morally.
Just because you don't like something doesn't make it wrong.
Yeah. And just because you can't look at something out of context.
No.
You just
and also, as you said, the emotional aspect of it really muddies the water. And I do, however, on the other hand, think emotion is important because I think emotion rallies people. It makes you react and do good and bad things. But when we're making decisions on a landscape level for conservation, for the environment, and at a species level for animals, we can't really let emotion dictate those decisions. Because we need science. We need the facts. Bullshit shouldn't be part of the story. Like, to the best of our knowledge, and with the information that we can obtain, what is the best route forward? And emotion will sometimes steer that in the opposite direction.
And I mean, it's a conversation that we always come back to on this show. It's a conversation that we often talk about on my other podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, is this conversation about evidence-based or evidence-informed legislation. We're not great at it in the States. I don't think we're great at it in other parts of the world. There are some parts of the world that are very good at evidence-informed legislation. But if there's anything that working as a psychologist as a psychotherapist, I apologize, I'm not a psychologist yet, over the years has taught me, it's that we can't decouple emotion from the legislative process. As much as we'd love to, and as much as we think we should be able to, the people who are making these decisions are still people. And those people are driven by their feelings. And so instead of, I think, steering, I use this metaphor, I don't think anybody really felt it in the room, but I used this metaphor
the other day in the conference?
In the symposium. That when you're driving and you hit a patch of ice, your first instinct is to turn the wheel against it. And that's most likely going to cause an accident. But if you just kind of steer into the slippage, and understand that the emotional conversation is always going to be a part of the conversation. So let's use it to our advantage instead of fighting against it. I think that we will be more effective in our rallying, and in our efforts to actually, like you said, utilize all the voices and ensure that all the voices in the room are heard and that we can come up with maybe not the perfect solution, unfortunately, but maybe one that's good enough.
Yeah. We can always strive to be better. And I'm not going to sit here as someone who enjoys hunting, because I do enjoy hunting, and suggest that is the answer to every wildlife solution, because it's not. But we need to find a way to have a conversation where people can accept that it's important. And it's not just in Africa. There's lots of countries around the world that utilize it really responsibly. And just to tie into what I was just saying about environmental responsibility, we live at a time where our impact on the planet through how we consume is becoming more and more obvious in terms of our negative impacts through increasing populations needing more agriculture. We can utilize wildlife in a responsible manner. And I think it is the responsible thing to do environmentally, because guess what? The wildlife actually belongs there.
Yeah.
So if we are replacing the wildlife and an ecosystem with something that we have reconstructed now, so we turn it into a cattle farm or we plow it up and plant a crop in it, it is not going to be as sympathetic to that landscape as sustainably harvesting a wild source of food. So we're talking about game here. I think in that way, if people can come around to it in that kind of understanding, where they can feel that they're really making the right choice, even if they don't want to go and partake in it themselves, but as long as they understand that this sort of harvestable surplus that can be obtained from good management of an area is something that can help us have less impact on the planet. then I think we would go some way towards making people feel a little bit more comfortable.
I think that's a good point that you're making, that, again, hunting's not the answer to every conservation problem, and you don't have to be a hunter to be a part of the solution.
Do you know what? I think somewhat the issue in probably one of the issues for North American listeners is that if you don't hunt, how do you consume actual wild meat? So you can consume a bison, which is a wild animal, but it'll be farmed. Yeah. Unless you've sourced it from somebody who hunts or you've hunted it yourself.
Yeah, I don't think people even know that. Like, if you go to a kind of a place that sells quote unquote exotic meats, because most people in North America eat chicken, beef, and pork if they eat meat. Beyond that, they might have lamb once in a while. Very few people eat goat, these domesticates. But if you're eating something in a restaurant that specializes in quote unquote exotic meat, like a bison burger, that's not a wild bison that you're eating.
I mean, it's still probably living in a wild-ish environment, but it is
farmed. It's bred,
and it has to be.
It's bred for meat consumption, and that's because of the way that our laws are written. Exactly. Yeah, I don't think people know that.
So, and I think that causes somewhat of a problem when we're talking about connecting an environmental responsibility of managing and harvesting a surplus of wild game, because you can't do it.
That's true.
You can if you're a hunter. Yeah. But you have no way of accessing that in North America.
But if I'm the kind of person who's like anti-gun and who just like doesn't really feel morally like I would be comfortable killing an animal, but I kind of understand why other people do. It's such a foreign concept to me, all these things we're talking about, because there is no real model outside of hunting in the United States.
So you need to befriend somebody who hunts so they can give you some actual wild meat. Whereas it's very different to the situation we have at home, in the UK, where you can go, if you live close by so you can drive, you can literally drive to the estate and say to them, "Can I buy a carcass from you, please?" So you don't, and that's what I do. And I've done it for friends of mine who don't hunt. I have one friend of mine, they used to be the neighbors to my parents, and Ralph, same name as my dad actually, but his wife's a vegetarian. Mm-hmm. And because he's just sort of fitting within their lifestyle, he basically became a vegetarian as well, but he still ate meat, but there's no point cooking 2 meals, right?
Flexitarian.
Yeah, so I suppose he was a flexitarian.
Semi-veg.
But for like 20 years or something like that, he didn't really eat any meat. Mm. But now he does. Mm. So we've actually taken him out hunting, and he shot his first pheasant last season, which was great, and it was so awesome to see this, the kind of reaction on his face at the kind of the responsibility he had taken. He actually shared that meal with his dad, which was awesome. But the reason that I tell that story is that there's a guy where, with that exception, he is now consuming in his household wild meat. But he didn't have to go and actually hunt it himself. Yeah. So we went I organized from the local estate for him and a couple of other friends who actually, they do hunt, but they don't stalk deer. They don't have centerfire rifles that you need to go and stalk deer. They just shoot shotguns.
What are all the words you just said?
I'll come back to it. Okay. I'll come back to it. So I'll finish the story first, and then I'll explain what I just said. But they don't hunt deer, although they do other forms of hunting. But they're able to go to the local estate and go and buy a carcass, and then take it home, butcher it up, and put it in their freezer.
It's just so appetizing when you call it a carcass.
You can either buy it with its skin on, or
Jesus
with its
Christ.
skin off.
Yeah. It's so foreign to me, which is hilarious because like I said, I grew up, I have an image burned into my brain of a deer with its throat cut, bleeding out, hanging from a tree, which is what we would do, and my father giving us an anatomy lesson on my grandfather's workbench, opening up the deer stomach to show us what it ate, and feeding its eyeballs to the dogs. I remember this, and I actually remember it quite fondly.
I've never fed eyeballs to my dogs.
You didn't?
No, I can't say I've ever done that. No.
Yeah, my dad always did that. Yeah. I don't know why. But yeah, it's so funny because now living in, my kind of sanitary house in Los Angeles and
what's your norm? And we have people.
What's my norm is like Whole Foods.
And we have,
Whole Foods actually sells game.
Does it really?
I think so, but of course it's all farmed.
Farm game,
yeah. But it's...
I mean, before I got my own house in my early 20s or whenever it was, and I was staying at my folks' place between going to university and what have you, I was always out hunting, and we always had, especially during the game season. By game season, I mean the bird season, because you can actually hunt something all year round in the UK. Mm-hmm. There would invariably on a weekend be something hanging up in the garage. Mm-hmm. But the kind of throughput of people who come and visit you, just in a normal day-to-day life, very few of those would have been hunting. My mom's friends or whoever it might be, but they always saw stuff hanging up.
Yeah,
and it was never a problem. It was never a problem because they were very clearly able to see the connection, and they would be the same people who would occasionally come around for dinner, and we would serve venison.
Yeah. And
hey, I remember I was here 3 months ago, and I saw some deer swinging outside as they were, curing for, we just call it hanging, but essentially just curing the meat for two weeks, say, depending on the temperatures outside, or if you've got a refrigerated unit, you can control it better. And so those connections were slowly built over time. So pretty much anybody who comes into our household knows and has seen it.
Mm-hmm. And let's be clear, before probably World War II, this is how everybody lived.
Yeah.
I mean...
This was not abnormal.
Yeah, before you had, Wonder Bread and...
What's Wonder Bread?
Oh, you don't know Wonder Bread? So I'm trying to think of classic processed food labels that have been around since kind of the mid-century. Yeah, before we had, Twinkies and Wonder Bread.
I know
and
Twinkies.
Yeah, and Campbell's soup and all of these things. People made their own food.
Yeah. And had their own vegetable patches.
Absolutely.
You look at some of the old butcher shop pictures in the UK, and I'm sure it's probably the same in the States. You would see the game hanging up outside with its fur on.
Yeah.
Rabbits, pheasant, partridges. They wouldn't hide the back room. You would see all the carcasses lined up, not just game, but agricultural, livestock as well.
Oh, now you have to go to Chinatown if you want to actually see the animal in its form. Yeah, it's true. It's still culturally there, and obviously in many parts of the world. But we have become, and I guess this is taking us full circle. Also, I don't want to make us late for our dinner reservations. But this is, we have become very distant from the source of our food. Mm. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons that these also very distant places, which don't feel so distant to me now, being here and seeing it in person, it's incredibly illuminating, having the opportunity that not everybody has, not everybody economically has the opportunity to visit these places. And the only time they'll ever be able to experience them is by watching a National Geographic documentary. But I think that we have to have the humility to remind ourselves on a regular basis that the way that we live is not the way that everybody lives. And what we think is best is not always what's best. It's often not what's best because we've not been there and we don't fucking know.
Yeah, we don't always have the information to make the best decisions.
So
and I didn't even explain centerfire rifles.
At least now I know you said center fired.
Oh, sorry, was I not speaking clearly?
No, you're
my British accent.
You absolutely speak clearly. We have different accents, and it sounded a bit like you said centified.
Oh no, center fire.
It's like roses, maybe, or jasmine. So I do want to bring things back around to the beginning of the conversation before we close out, because we opened up talking about your work as a filmmaker.
Which we haven't talked about at all.
Right? With a very strong conservation focus. We also mentioned that you personally are a hunter, and we also talked about the work that you were doing with the pangolins, and so I thought maybe we could take a few more minutes to talk about all those things so people can meet you a little bit better.
So, just to wrap up the pangolin story, and if nothing else, to raise awareness of it. As I said at the start, they are the most trafficked mammal in the world.
And they're trafficked. So by now, maybe you've looked at a pangolin, but this is something that's
like a scaly dog.
Yeah, but it's like within the anteater family, right?
Is,
or the aardvark family, or maybe even, I don't know if echidnas or echindas. I can never fucking say that word.
Do you know what that is?
They're Australian, right? And they're kind of like, they look like weird hedgehogs with long noses.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah. But the pangolin is such a funny, facultative quadruped. Like it walks on its hind legs a lot.
Yeah.
It has these massive keratin scales, and that's what they're trafficked for.
Exactly. So it's exactly the same material as a rhino horn.
Gotcha.
Same thing.
And this all kind of comes down to...
We're looking at each other smiling. It comes down to
boner pills in China.
That's what it is. Yeah. as we were joking in the plane the other day, maybe we should just mass drop Viagra across that entire part of the world.
Yeah, but just put it in the water.
Yeah, or put it in the water. Yeah. But I think there are some other uses for it, but essentially it's the same material.
Mm.
You know, it's keratin. It's your fingernails.
And these are such, unique, and
they're incredible. I nearly cried when I saw one.
Did you? Time. You held one. You had to carry one.
So the hospital for them, they call it the hospital, it's like the rehabilitation center, is in Johannesburg, or it's near Johannesburg. And what happens when they do a lot of sting operations, they're involved in a lot of sting operations. So when they confiscate a pangolin, they take it to the rehabilitation
From a poacher,
normally through a tip. It could be someone who's deliberately gone and poached it. It could be somebody who's just come by it. I mean, sometimes they get a phone call saying, "I've found this thing."
Yeah.
But more often than not, it is deliberate poaching of it.
Or they find it in luggage at an airport, or you hear these.
They found one on just the side of the road, but it was in town, so it definitely didn't get there by itself. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so they go to the rehabilitation center. A vet checks them out. They work out if they're damaged, which very often they are, because they're pretty abusive to them, because they don't need to be alive.
Yeah, they just need the scales.
So what they do is they squash them and dry them and stick them in a container. There was 42 tons. A pangolin weighs between 50. These pangolin we're talking about, the pteric pangolin, they weigh about 15 to 25 kilos. And they found 42 tons of them in a container in February. So they go to the rehabilitation center, they check them out, and then they go through the process of rehab, which could be fixing wounds to start with. But then they have to feed them. Now, the interesting thing about them is that you can't really, apart from with a tube, you can't artificially feed them unless you literally go and scoop up an ant heap and put it in the cage with them.
Because they have these weird tongues.
Yeah,
and that's
they need to stick their tongue down the hole where the ants live and scoop out the ants and larvae is what they prefer. They don't really, from my understanding of the conversations that I had, I don't want to come across as an expert in it. This is just the knowledge that's been imparted on me, is that they don't really like termites, unlike an aardvark. So they have to go walk them. They literally, there is volunteers and people who work within they're all volunteers within the African Pangolin Working Group, and they go and walk these pangolin in
Do they have leashes?
No leash. But you just have to monitor them. So they're not that fast. So you just walk around with them for 4 or 5 hours a day so that they can eat in this undisclosed area that they use. And they had, a couple of weeks ago, they had 4 in the hospital. So do the maths on that.
Yeah.
That's like walking pangolin for an entire day. So it's massively, massively intensive. And that's how I had the opportunity to hold one.
Yeah.
Was that there was this young pangolin that they were walking, and you had to take it from its crate to the area, and then once it finished eating, pick it up again and put it back in its crate to take it back to the hospital.
And are they aggressive, or are they just like, I'm chill to do this right now?
An older one that has been abused might not be that fond of picking up. And actually, they can be quite reactive to male voices because it tends to be males that are doing the poaching.
Oh, that's so sad. But of course, this is probably why it's so easy. I mean, they're elusive, like you said, but it's so easy, unfortunately, to poach them is because they're like, sure, I'll come along with you. Just
pick them up. But that's the sad reality of it. But this little guy he hadn't really been abused. So he was very calm and chilled out, and I arrived there. The professor of the working group took me there, and to see them, and because afterwards I was going up to actually do a release with one of his team, and I sat down. I had my camera in my hand, and I sat down in the dirt, in the bush with like thorn trees above me, and he was already out. He had been taken out, and he was like snuffling, and they make this like little piggy snuffling noise as they're trying to. I assume it's because as they're trying to scent, they're trying to find the right place to go and stick their tongue down to go and get the juicy as eggs. And I couldn't say anything. For like 20 seconds, I'm sitting there and I can feel it now. I could feel this emotion that I wasn't expecting to feel. Because by that point, I knew quite a lot about them because we'd spent 2 months raising money to buy thermal and camera traps for conservation efforts. And I had no expectation that I was going to feel like that when I sat down. And I'm not sure, I still can't quite work out why. The best that I can come to is because I was so acutely aware of the difficulties they face as a species and the fact that if we don't change something, they're gone. When I spoke to Professor Janssen, he said, look, it's simple. If we don't do something, if we don't change the trend, in 20 years, there will be no pangolin left. That's it. Game over, finished.
And this is a species that many people listening are only hearing about for the first time now.
That's the crazy thing. And I think that's what made me sad.
Yeah.
But then after that, I started to enjoy this interaction with an animal that I would have never had the opportunity. And hopefully through like the podcasts that we did with the guys, which actually just released yesterday with the guys on the ground, and through some of the social media that we're doing and through articles, it's going to help increasingly raise awareness of the species. And then people will begin to care more and hopefully actually support the people who are doing good work.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the pangolin story. And then we went on, and there was actually one that had finished rehab, and we were releasing it for the first time with sat tags and telemetry chips and stuff as well, so that we could follow them. And that was another amazing experience because this was a success. This was something that had been taken, had been retaken by the authorities, given to the African Pangolin Working Group, gone through the rehab, and now was going through this soft release process where it was literally being monitored on the ground every night, and then for many, many weeks. And it was great to see they were working with a local farm up in the north of South Africa, and the local farm manager, he had taken it upon himself to caretake for this pangolin.
Yeah.
And he had never even seen one.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because most people haven't. So where can people can hear the podcast that you did, and where can they start to see some of the work that you do in filmmaking, in storytelling, so that they can learn more about these conservation issues? So
the best place to find that, so for the podcast, if you just search Into the Wilderness on any podcast app, you'll pick it up. And the most recent one is all about pangolin. So you'll have a better understanding if you listen to that. The chap we interviewed was Francois Meyer, and he is studying for his master's and working with the Pangolin Working Group. The crazy thing speaking to him was that every now and then I'd ask him a question because of my own intrigue, and he's like, you know what? No one knows. Like gestation period. No one knows.
Yeah.
That's where people can find the podcast and the filmmaking stuff, which is very much centered around things like that. So I am going to be making a film about a short film about pangolin conservation in the same way that we've made one about the plight of sea trout due to fish farms. We did one recently with David Attenborough about he was kind enough to narrate it for us, about the plight of salmon globally, so North America and over into Europe. And all of that can be found on our website, which is paceproductionsuk.com. And the other goings on that we're involved in, between the podcast and the filmmaking and the hunting that we do, that's all on our Instagram, Pace_brothers. And we also actually have...
Say that one more time.
Pace_brothers.
Pace_brothers.
And the pacebrothers.com is... basically where everything is. So the filmmaking stuff is within our production company, but all the other stuff that we do, because everything that I've been talking about, I do with my brother, but he doesn't happen to be here, which is why I haven't been referencing him, but he is the co-host of our podcast. So while we've been here, I've been doing like one intro, he's been recording the other intro. But that's all on the pacebrothers.com.
Great. Well, Byron, you think you're off the hook, but you're not. So don't think that you could have...
I'm getting hungry now.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't think you could have showered before leaving for this dinner, because you don't have time. I have to ask you before we go, I close every podcast asking my guests the same two questions, and I get shit when I forget to do it. So I've got to make sure I do it with you right now. And these are big picture questions. Something tells me you have big picture answers. And we may even already know the answer, so they could just be summaries. Who knows? But when you think about the future and whatever context is relevant to you right now as we speak, that could be a very personal context or it could be a global one. Number one, what is the thing that does keep you up the most at night? The thing that maybe you're even borderline pessimistic, possibly even cynical about? The thing that you are just legitimately the most worried about? But on the flip side of that, I want to know what you are like genuinely optimistic about. The thing that you're quite excited and that you aren't just paying lip service to, but you really are looking forward to.
The thing that keeps me up at night, I think it's been compounded by spending the last month here in Africa, but it's on my mind all the time because I spend a lot of time here. But it's not just related to Africa, but is the genuine loss of wildlife that we are seeing around the world. And
alarming,
it really,
yeah.
I mean, just everything. Rate. And it's such a massive topic that it's hard to work out even where to start with that. But it was really brought home to me when I watched the first episode of Our Planet.
Yeah.
And the opening 10 minutes of that is just a list of all the loss of wildlife within my lifetime.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if within the life that I have left, whether some of the species that I know very well, especially in an African context, when we're looking at threatened and endangered species like pangolin, which now has a special place in my heart, I don't know whether they're still going to exist. How much does that matter? And that's probably the thing that concerns me most, is I don't know if people really stop to think about it. How much does that matter to you? And when you are so removed from it, when it is the other side of the world, it's not my problem.
Yeah.
It's not my issue. Yeah, and then beyond that, at home, we are, I almost don't want to use the word fighting, but it kind of feels like it. We are continually fighting within the hunting community. Sorry, not within the hunting community. The hunting community is continually fighting to keep the hunting practices that we have alive. And we could do an entire show on grouse management, but that is the one of the hot topics.
I still don't know what a grouse is.
Do you know what a quail is?
Yes.
Okay, it's like a big quail. Kind of. That's so crude. But it's like a big quail. It's a bird. It's a game bird that's hunted. And there is the management of our merlins is so fragile, and yet we are in such a precarious position with the continuation of the current management that we have due to outside forces, largely supported by celebrities with fairly limited knowledge and a very clear agenda, that they are changing government policy like at the click of a finger. While I've been in Africa, they revoked general licenses, which was an ability to control pest species, without going into any more detail than that, which at a time of year where every bird is breeding and all the farmers are growing their crops, we have so many endangered and red-listed bird species at home which rely on the control of these predators. And overnight, with a 3 days notice, Natural England revoked all its licenses on the back of public pressure with limited knowledge and not backed by science. That scares me. We saw the same thing in British Columbia with grizzly bears.
This all sounds very bad. What are you hopeful about? Give me something good.
I'm hopeful in the enthusiasm of my generation now, because I think that the more conversations I have and the more people I meet, like meeting you guys here, yourself and Jason, out with the hunting community, I meet more and more who are willing to listen and help me understand, as well as me help them understand, where a consensus can be formed for us to move forward in a way that wildlife and human beings can exist in the same environment, but in a way that is good for both, and where they both have a place. And that enthusiasm excites me, because I've seen it. And those discussions which just keep going into the night, like I feel empowered after I have those discussions. And that for me is what keeps me going.
Byron Pace, Pace Productions, Into the Wilderness, as you said. Thank you so much. This was incredibly illuminating. We talked for much longer than I usually talk to my guests. So,
but thank you for having me on. And thank you for being here.
Absolutely. I mean, it's more than a joy. It's kind of hard to put it into words, but thank you. This has just been incredible. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.